Billy had been awake for 63 hours when the laughter finally broke in. He sat in his empty apartment at 4:22 a.m. on Tuesday morning, surrounded by the detritus of his desperate vigil, empty pizza boxes, overflowing ashtrays, and enough energy drink cans to build a small fort. The television blared infomercials at maximum volume, but even the constant noise couldn't drown out the sound that had been echoing in his head since Sarah's funeral 2 days ago. His own laughter, hollow and broken, playing on an endless loop. The joke had started innocently enough during Sarah's memorial service. Father Phillips had been delivering a somber eulogy about brilliant young minds cut short in their prime, when Billy's exhausted brain had made an inappropriate connection between Sarah's academic obsession and the phrase, studying herself to death. The pun had bubbled up from somewhere deep in his psyche, and before he could stop himself, he'd let out a sharp bark of laughter that echoed through the church. The horrified stares from the congregation should have shut him up immediately. His friend's mortified expressions should have snapped him back to reality. But once the laughter started, Billy found he couldn't stop it. It poured out of him in wave after wave, each burst more hysterical than the last, until 2 ushers had to escort him from the sanctuary while he giggled uncontrollably into his hands. That had been 48 hours ago, and the laughter hadn't stopped since. It wasn't the healthy laughter of someone who found genuine joy in humor. This was something else entirely, a mechanical response that his damaged psyche produced whether he willed it or not. He'd laugh at commercials, at the sound of sirens, at nothing at all. The sound would bubble up from his throat without warning, a broken giggle that made him sound like a malfunctioning toy. Billy knew he was losing his mind, but even that realization struck him as hilariously funny. His apartment had become a shrine to manic desperation. Comedy DVDs were stacked everywhere. Carlin, Murphy, Pryor, anyone who might teach him new material to keep the performance going. His notebook was filled with increasingly dark jokes, observations about death and loss that would have been career suicide for any working comedian but felt like lifelines to Billy's fragmenting sanity. The phone had been ringing all evening, his mother calling from her new life with her new boyfriend, probably wanting to check on him after the embarrassing scene at the funeral. But Billy couldn't bring himself to answer. Instead, he practiced his material on the empty apartment, pacing back and forth while delivering increasingly frantic monologues to an audience of dirty dishes and unpaid bills. "So my mom left my dad for her personal trainer," he said to the coffee table, his voice hoarse from overuse. "I guess you could say she was really committed to her workout routine. She's been doing squats for 6 months now," on his face. Billy erupted into mechanical laughter at his own joke, the sound echoing off the walls and coming back to him distorted and strange. He was performing for ghosts now, for the shadows that seemed to move independently in his peripheral vision. His reflection in the black television screen showed a stranger, hollow-eyed and pale, with the distinctive rictus grin of someone whose facial muscles had locked into a permanent expression of false joy. He'd been smiling for so long that it physically hurt to change expressions, the muscles cramping when he tried to frown. The clock on the wall showed 4:48 a.m., but time had become meaningless. Day and night blurred together into one endless performance featuring Billy, class clown extraordinaire. He'd been mixing uppers and downers for the past 2 days, caffeine pills to stay awake, his mother's leftover anxiety medication to take the edge off his panic, whatever he could find to maintain the chemical balance that kept him conscious and performing. The combination made his heart race and his hands shake, but it also kept the nightmares at bay. Because Billy knew that sleep meant death. Tommy had died in his dreams. Sarah had died in her dreams. The pattern was clear, and Billy's mind understood that he was next in line for the final performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to his empty living room, "the amazing Billy Crawford will now attempt his most death-defying act, staying awake until he literally dies of exhaustion. No net, no safety measures, just good old-fashioned self-destruction disguised as entertainment." The laughter that followed was so violent it made his ribs ache. Billy stumbled to the kitchen and dry-swallowed another handful of caffeine pills, chasing them with the dregs of a 5-hour energy drink that tasted like chemical sludge. His vision wavered, and for a moment he thought he saw a small figure sitting at his kitchen table, a child in a party hat, watching him with eyes that were definitely not alive. But when he blinked and looked again, there was nothing there except the accumulated mess of his breakdown. His phone started ringing again, and this time Billy grabbed it without checking the caller ID. Crawford Residence, home of the funniest dead man walking. How can I make you laugh today? Billy? Jesus Christ, son, what's wrong with you? His father's voice sounded genuinely concerned, which was unusual enough to penetrate Billy's manic haze. Dad. Great to hear from you. How's it going with your secretary? Are you practicing your putting in her backyard, if you know what I mean? Billy, stop. Just stop for a minute and listen to me. Your mother called. She said you had some kind of breakdown at the funeral. Are you using drugs? The question struck Billy as so absurdly funny that he doubled over with laughter, the phone slipping from his grip and clattering to the floor. By the time he recovered enough to pick it up, the line had gone dead. That's comedy gold, folks, he announced to his audience of shadows. Dad's worried about drugs. Because that's definitely the biggest problem in my life right now. The laughter felt like shards of glass in his throat. Billy tried to return to his pacing routine, but his legs gave out and he collapsed onto the couch. He could feel consciousness starting to slip away despite his best efforts to maintain it. His eyelids felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. The apartment seemed to darken around him, though the lamps burned as brightly as before. The shadows in the corners began to take on weight and substance, coalescing into shapes that shouldn't exist. No, 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 Billy muttered, slapping himself hard across the face. The show must go on. The audience is waiting. But even his own voice sounded distant now, as if it were coming from the bottom of a well. The familiar weight of impending sleep pressed down on him like a lead blanket, and Billy felt his performance finally beginning to falter. The transition was so smooth he almost didn't notice it happening. One moment he was fighting consciousness in his living room, the next he was standing in what appeared to be a child's birthday party. The decorations were perfect, colorful streamers hanging from the ceiling, balloons bobbing in corners, a table loaded with cake and ice cream and party favors. It should have been a joyful scene, but something was fundamentally wrong with the picture. The children were dead. Not recently dead, these kids had been gone for a long time. Their flesh hung in gray tatters from skeletal frames, their party hats perched at jaunty angles on partially decomposed skulls. But they were still celebrating, still laughing and clapping and demanding entertainment with the relentless enthusiasm of children who didn't understand that the party was over. Billy. Billy. Billy, they chanted in unison, their voices creating a harmony that sounded like wind through cemetery gates. Make us laugh. Make us laugh. Billy found himself wearing his best performing outfit, the suit he'd bought for his high school talent show, now somehow transformed into a garish clown costume complete with oversized shoes and a red rubber nose. He tried to remove the costume, but it seemed to be fused to his skin, part of him now in ways that defied explanation. Welcome to the party, funny boy. The voice came from the head of the table, where a tall figure in a burned and tattered sweater sat wearing a paper crown that read, Birthday Boy. The creature's melted face gestured with razor-fingered hands toward the audience of dead children. These kids have been waiting so long for a good show, it continued with obvious delight. They died at their own birthday parties, you see. Choked on cake, allergic reactions, accidents with candles. But they're still hungry for entertainment. The dead children applauded with skeletal hands, the sound like dice rattling in a cup. Their hollow eye sockets fixed on Billy with the unblinking attention of an audience that would never leave, never get bored, never let him stop performing. I don't have any material prepared, Billy stammered, though even as he said it, he could feel jokes bubbling up from somewhere deep in his psyche. His body was already moving, shifting into the familiar rhythms of stand-up comedy. Oh, but you do, the burn thing replied with mock sympathy. You've got a lifetime of pain and disappointment to work with. These kids love tragedy. It's their favorite kind of humor. Billy found himself beginning to speak, the words pouring out of him with mechanical precision. So, my parents got divorced last year, he heard himself say, though he had no memory of choosing to speak. My mom left my dad for her personal trainer. I guess you could say she was really committed to working out his problems with his wife. The dead children erupted in laughter, but it wasn't the warm, appreciative sound that Billy remembered from his successful performances. This was something colder, hungrier, as if they were feeding on his humiliation rather than enjoying his wit. More. More, they demanded, clapping their bone hands together with increasing enthusiasm. My dad moved to Phoenix with his secretary, Billy continued, unable to stop the flow of self-deprecating material. He said he needed a fresh start. I guess 20 years of marriage really takes it out of you, along with half your assets and your dignity. More laughter, more applause, but Billy could see something disturbing happening to the children. With each joke, each burst of forced humor, they seemed to become more solid, more alive, while he felt himself becoming lighter, emptier. "What's the matter, Billy?" the burned thing asked with feigned concern. "You don't look like you're enjoying yourself. Nobody thinks you're funny anymore." I am funny," Billy protested weakly. "I make people laugh. That's what I do." "But do you make yourself laugh?" the creature pressed, leaning forward with obvious interest. "Or are you just a broken record, playing the same sad songs over and over?" Billy tried to answer, but found that he could only continue with his routine, his mouth moving independently of his conscious will. "The worst part about the divorce," he said, "is that I finally understand why they stayed together so long. They were both waiting for me to get old enough to handle the trauma. Thanks, Mom and Dad. Nothing says, 'we love you,' like using your childhood as a timer for when to destroy the family." The dead children shrieked with delight, but their laughter was becoming more aggressive, more demanding. "That's a real knee slapper," the burned thing announced with obvious satisfaction. "But let's get to the good stuff. Tell them about the rope, Billy. Tell them about the nights when the jokes weren't enough to keep the darkness away." Billy's performance took a darker turn, his body moving without his permission as he began to act out increasingly self-destructive scenarios. He found himself miming hanging himself, the invisible rope tight around his neck while the dead children applauded his suffering. "Ladies and gentlemen," he gasped through his constricted throat, "the amazing Billy will now demonstrate the ultimate punchline, death. But don't worry, folks, I'll be here all week," which is about how long it takes for a body to decompose. The laughter was roaring now, bouncing off the party room walls and echoing inside Billy's skull until he couldn't tell where the sound ended and his own thoughts began. He was drowning in artificial joy, suffocating on the very thing he'd spent his life trying to create. But then the burned thing stepped forward, those razor fingers gleaming in the twisted party lights. "You know what would be really funny, Billy?" it said, its voice cutting through the cacophony of dead children's laughter. "If we made this performance permanent." Billy tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The dead children had formed a circle around him now, their pale faces twisted with hungry anticipation. Their birthday hats sat crooked on rotting skulls, and their party favors were makeshift surgical instruments that gleamed with malicious intent. "No, no, no," the burned thing said with mock disappointment. "The show must go on, kiddo. And I know exactly how to make sure you never stop smiling." It gestured to the dead children, who began to move with mechanical precision. Small hands grabbed Billy's arms and legs, holding him perfectly still while others produced spools of thick black thread and curved needles that looked like they'd been stolen from a mortician's kit. "Even Mommy couldn't stand your act," the creature taunted as the dead children began their work. "She left Daddy for another man because living with a desperate clown was too depressing. All those years of fake laughter, all that pathetic need for attention. No wonder she ran away." The first needle pierced the corner of Billy's mouth, and he screamed, a sound that only made the dead children giggle with delight. The thread was coarse and scratchy, like the kind used to sew together corpses, and it pulled through his flesh with the sound of tearing fabric. Billy felt the thread weaving through his lips, pulling them wider and wider with each stitch. The pain was excruciating, but worse was the realization that his mouth was being sewn into a grin that stretched far beyond human proportions. The corners of his mouth were being pulled back past his ears, splitting the skin and exposing the muscle and bone beneath. "That's it," the burned thing exclaimed with sadistic glee. "Now you're getting into the spirit. Tell us another joke, Billy. Make us laugh." Billy tried to speak, tried to scream, but the sewn flesh made every word a torment. Blood poured down his chin as the stitches pulled tighter, but somehow sound still emerged from his mutilated mouth. What do you call a comedian who never stops smiling?" he heard himself say, the words distorted by his ruined lips. "Dead." The laughter that followed was roaring, and Billy realized with dawning horror that it was coming from his own throat. His damaged vocal cords were producing the sound against his will. The dead children weren't finished. They produced more needles, more thread, and began sewing his eyes open, forcing his lids apart with tiny, precise stitches that made tears of blood stream down his cheeks. Now he couldn't even close his eyes to shut out the nightmare. He was forced to watch his own mutilation with clarity. "The audience wants to see your expressions," the burned thing explained with professional enthusiasm. "Can't have you missing a single moment of your own performance." Billy's forced smile grew wider still, the stitches pulling his flesh so tight that it began to tear at the stress points. His cheeks split open, revealing the white bone of his skull beneath. But still the dead children worked, adding more thread, more tension, pulling his face into an expression of such extreme joy that it had become its own form of torture. "Now for the grand finale," the creature announced, producing a rusty can opener from the folds of its tattered sweater. "We need to make sure this smile goes all the way to your brain." Billy watched in helpless terror as the can opener approached his forehead. The burned thing began to cut a neat circle in his skull, just above his hairline, working with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this many times before. The sound was horrible, metal scraping against bone, accompanied by Billy's own involuntary laughter that grew more hysterical with each passing second. "Look at that beautiful brain," the creature observed as it lifted away the circular piece of skull like a lid. "All those comedy neurons firing at once. Let's see what happens when we add a little stimulation." It reached into Billy's exposed brain with those razor fingers, touching the gray matter directly. Billy's forced laughter became a shriek of agony as electricity shot through his nervous system. But his sewn-open mouth wouldn't allow him to express pain, only joy, only the artificial happiness that had been his trademark and was now his torture. "Tell us about the rope in your closet," the thing commanded, its claws moving deeper into Billy's brain. "The one you practiced with when Mommy was at work, crying over her new boyfriend." Billy felt his deepest secrets being pulled out of his head like weeds from a garden. Every private moment of despair, every time he'd considered ending his own pain, every desperate fantasy of finally making the laughter stop, all of it was being extracted and displayed for the amusement of his dead audience. I wanted to make people happy," he gasped through his mutilated mouth, blood and brain fluid mingling on his lips. "I just wanted someone to love me." "And they do love you," the burned thing replied with mock tenderness. "Look how they're laughing. This is the best performance of your career." The dead children were indeed laughing, but their laughter was consuming Billy from the inside out. With each giggle, each chuckle, each burst of artificial joy, something essential was being drained from him. His personality, his memories, his very soul were being devoured by their hungry amusement. Billy felt himself becoming hollow, empty, nothing but a vessel for other people's entertainment. The boy who'd used humor to hide his pain was being stripped away layer by layer, until all that remained was the painted smile and the desperate need to make others laugh. "Smile for the camera, kiddo," the burned thing said, producing an ancient flash camera that looked like it had been forged in hell. "This is your best performance yet." The flash exploded with blinding intensity, but Billy's sewn-open eyes couldn't close to protect him from the light. The photograph captured him in his final moment, brain exposed, face split into an impossible grin, tears of blood streaming down his cheeks while dead children applauded his suffering. The show must go on. Billy heard himself scream, though he no longer understood what the words meant. His identity had been completely consumed by his performance, leaving behind nothing but a broken comedian telling jokes to an audience of corpses. The last thing Billy Crawford ever experienced was the sound of his own laughter, not the forced humor he'd used to mask his pain, but something deeper and more terrible. The laughter of someone whose mind had finally snapped under the weight of performing happiness for others, whose sanity had been stretched beyond the breaking point and left him cackling in the darkness as his consciousness finally flickered out. The party continued without him, the dead children's applause echoing through dimensions where sound had no meaning and joy had been twisted into something monstrous and hungry. Billy's body remained in the center of the circle, that impossible smile frozen on his face for eternity, a testament to what happened when the need for approval consumed everything else that made a person human. Linda Crawford found her son's body at 11:30 a.m. when she came to check on him after he'd missed their planned lunch date. Billy was sitting on his couch, remote control in hand, as if he'd simply fallen asleep watching television. But it was his expression that would haunt her for the rest of her life, a smile so wide and fixed that it looked more like a wound than an expression of joy. The coroner would determine that Billy had died of cardiac arrest, his heart simply stopping sometime in the early morning hours. What they couldn't explain was the smile itself, which remained frozen on Billy's face even after rigor mortis had set in. The muscle contractions required to maintain such an expression should have been impossible in death, but there it was, a grin that spoke of laughter pushed beyond the breaking point. The only other unusual detail was the small pile of confetti found scattered around Billy's body, colored paper that looked like it had come from a child's birthday party. But there had been no celebration in the Crawford apartment for months, no reason for party decorations to be present. The confetti would be swept up and discarded, just another inexplicable detail in a case that defied rational explanation. But those who knew Billy best would remember his final performance not as tragedy, but as the inevitable conclusion to a life spent mining pain for humor. He had finally found the ultimate punchline, and it had killed him with laughter.